Good morning, everyone. We are going to give all the participants just a few minutes to get logged in, and then we will start about 2 minutes after the hour. If you are just joining us, we are just waiting for a few minutes before we get started to give everyone some time to log in, and we'll get going here shortly. All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and get started. I know some people are still joining, but thank you so much for joining us this morning. Welcome to the Burr Morning Show. I am joined this morning by my colleague, Bill Wasden. My name is Emily Mack. I am in the Nashville office of Burr and Foreman, and Bill is down in Mobile. How's the weather there this morning, Bill?
Bright and sunny, and watching the spring break traffic head to Pensacola.
Great. Well, we are going to be talking this morning to you all about flexible work arrangement policies, and I am taking it by the number of participants that we have registered to join us here for this webinar that this is a hot topic, and it's something that you all want to hear about. And what we are going to be focusing on in our presentation this morning and in talking with you is really how do you go about drafting one of these policies, what components should you be thinking of, and try to give you guys some advice as everyone turns to those employee handbooks to start thinking about, how we develop these policies and some pitfalls to avoid and some things that you might want to include. And so we're going to get started here with a quick video that I think sets the tone for this topic.
Team, we officially have a return to office date. It's a no for me. So I wanted to see how we're all feeling. Amazing. I'm gonna stop. I'll be there this afternoon. We're not open today. Hypothetically, what if I've moved quite far away? Does HR know? Hypothetically. Right. Teresa, any thoughts? Oh, I quit. Just like that. I need to go shopping. I haven't gotten any confirmation on dress code. I'll be staying remote. Great. This will be fun.
So I think that this really helps kind of capture what I know a lot of our HR professionals and business owners are dealing with right now. We're all trying to kind of develop, how do we get people back to the office? How do we continue to kind of navigate this post-pandemic world that we're living in? And I think what we're seeing is some resistance from employees on coming back to the office, the terms on which they're going to come back to the office. And at the same time, we are facing a labor shortage. We have some positions that are getting more difficult to fill, and the leverage here has really shifted to employees. And so from a recruitment standpoint and a retention standpoint, even if remote work or flexible work was not something that traditionally employers had to deal with, we're having to deal with it now. Bill, are you seeing this in your practice?
Absolutely, Emily. We have instances where longtime valued employees have asked to be able to continue to work remotely. The employer, for reasons specific to those particular employees, would deny that request or take a long time to think about it. And those employees are picking up and leaving. I know of a 30-year software engineer that asked to continue to be working remotely. This was at a location outside of Dallas. And he was denied that opportunity, and he had relocated here to Alabama. And from the Industrial Revolution all the way through the 80s, if that was the era of the peak of employer leverage, I think now the tables have turned, and we have employee leverage confronting employers and making these decisions like we never have had before.
Yeah, I think that the pandemic has just kind of escalated that, right? This was a trend that we saw from even before the pandemic started, with just people leaving the workforce and things of that nature. But we're really now the leverage has shifted. And so, I think another great point about this video was, finding out that some of our employees have relocated without our permission, right? And so while routinely employers were able to kind of deny these requests, you're in a more difficult position now with just denying them outright when you have let people work remotely on an entire workforce basis, for maybe a year or more for some employers. And so, Bill, do you have any statistics? I mean, do we have any idea what percentage of the population has actually returned to work or is dealing with this right now?
Well, the most recent, as of 10 days ago, actually, the most recent studies have shown that 42% of employees have returned. 58% are still working remote, and that's an amazing statistic. And this comes from a company that studies the access card swipe data. For those of you that didn't know, that your access card data has been monetized and sold and is being analyzed, rest assured that it is. But yeah, only 42% of office workers have returned to work within the office, and that doesn't measure whether or not they're working in one of the flexible arrangements that we're going to discuss more today, whether they're only coming in 2 days or 3 days and what have you. And the studies that are being cited by many HR professionals are that the productivity has actually been shown to increase when an employee is permitted to work 1 to 2 days at home. You would think it might be the opposite, but in fact, it reveals that the office culture is full of distractions, in addition to the ability of supervisors to monitor.
That's an excellent point. So not only do we have the employee leverage, but also there's a business reason that kind of lends itself to supporting and kind of leaning into this. So let's kind of dig into this. And I want to encourage people, if you have questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A. box, and we will try to address those as we kind of go through this material to the extent that we can. So, you know, the starting point for any type of framework for drafting a policy that involves flexible work arrangements, and I think we're using that term intentionally, right? I mean, this is no longer, you know, do you just solely want to look at remote work? Flexible work arrangements can involve a lot of different things, you know, including flexibility in scheduling of work hours, so modified, you know, work hours, the ability to flexibility in the amount of hours worked, reduced schedule, job sharing is a type, you know, a new concept that we're kind of you know, seeing, and then obviously flexibility in the place of work. And that can be a permanent remote role or more of a hybrid arrangement. You know, I think as much as you as an employer have the flexibility to decide how you want, what types of arrangements will work for your business and for different job positions that you have, you also have the flexibility to kind of carve out what isn't going to be an FWA. You know, if you pull out your old handbook and dust it off, you know, it probably has some type of, you know, policy that refers to telecommuting or remote work and requiring manager approval or HR approval. And the reality is that, you know, for a lot of especially office workers, there may be instances, you know, a snow day or an, you know, an occasional instance where they have to work from home. That probably for most business settings isn't going to be a formal FWA type arrangement that you're going to require people to go through the hurdles of requesting and receiving approval for. Any thoughts on that, Bill?
Absolutely. Those points are well made, Emily, and the HR professionals in their exchange of notes and observations in the conferences that we've addressed this thus far have arrived at the conclusion that the optimal ratio of remote work versus in-office attendance is a 3-2 ratio, where 3 days working remotely is viewed to be the most productive, allowing the employee to select with the confer with the HR, the supervisor, his or her supervisor, whether or not they want to come in those other 2 days, whether they want to stagger it, 1 and 1, 1 and 2, Monday, Wednesdays, Fridays, what have you. But it's the new paradigm is apparently 2 days in the office, 3 days working remotely for those employers that have agreed that this flexible work arrangement works for them and their employees.
And this is an area too where I think, you know, more so than other policies, you know, this is certainly an area where you cannot just take a blanket policy and drop it in your handbook and think that it's going to work. You need to put some thought into, you know, how are we going to define what it is, what it isn't. You know, you may want to say, you know, listen, people want to work from home the week between Christmas and New Year's or certain other weeks, you know, when business needs, you know, are less, you know, we're going to allow that. And it doesn't require some type of a formal FWA request. It's just going to be the new normal for our business because that's what works, you know, for us as a business. And so, you know, I can't stress enough that that's exactly why we're talking about, you know, how do you go about drafting this policy in a way that works for your business, for your employees? So let's get into some, I know we've touched on some of these different types of arrangements, but, you know, I think these can encompass, you know, again, remote work, alternative work schedules, you know, or work hours. This is something that I think is pretty big for working parents. We have a huge percentage of working of mothers and women who have left the working world during COVID because of concerns about childcare. If we're able to, you know, if an employer is able and willing to kind of adjust work hours, you know, that may, you know, open up your business to a whole nother segment of workers that, you know, right now is kind of locked out. You know, reduced hours, job sharing, you know, having 2 different part-time employees fill one FTE role is another thing that, again, especially in these harder to fill roles right now, if you go and you take those and start looking at what are other ways that we can get the operational needs that we have met through a less traditional structure for the job, that's going to open up doors, I think, for employers that historically haven't thought about how to recruit and retain that type of talent. Bill, do you have thoughts on other types of hybrid arrangements that your clients have been considering?
I think that that overview pretty much sums it up, Emily.
Okay.
The bottom line is, if you have employees that are performing the bulk, if not the entirety of their work in your operation on a computer screen or over the phone with very little external interaction with clients or customers or vendors, in-person contact, then there literally, and this is what employers are finding, there literally is no reason that they cannot perform those services in that same fashion from a remote location. And what it comes down to, and what we have seen, and what we are responding to employers about, is traditional employers want to favor the in-office culture over the employees' concerns for flexibility. And so employers are having to ask themselves, what matters to me? And am I just adhering to a traditional physical supervisory setting when it really wasn't necessary, when I can ensure productivity and discipline and compliance, as well as cybersecurity, which is a whole other issue that we address, and allow the employee the flexibility. So all of these arrangements are simply a way to respond to the employee's preference for and request for increased flexibility in how they perform their jobs for the employer.
Right. I think those are all excellent points. So let's get into kind of some of the more granular aspects of one of these policies, right? I mean, I think, aside from defining, what is going to be a flexible work arrangement policy, what types of flexible work arrangement policies is the employer going to consider and are appropriate, for the business, you also need to look at eligibility, right? I mean, frankly, not every position is going to be suited for some type of remote work or, even one of these FWAs potentially, right? Your business is going to dictate that. Your customers are going to dictate that. The job itself is going to dictate that. And so doing that work on the front end, I would encourage, I know, if you don't have the job descriptions, here's our plug for why those are another reason why those are important, and we should update them and make sure that you have adequate job descriptions. But I think that can often be, the starting point for evaluating, what types of jobs are suited for this and what aren't. You may say, depending on your structure, we want to, you need to work for a certain period of time with the company before you're going to be eligible for one of these. Now, again, goes back to recruiting and retention. In the job market and for certain positions, you may not have that flexibility and may even be trying to use some type of a FWA policy to recruit talent in a different area to fill an immediate need. But another thing to consider, right? Because there is a higher degree of trust and expectations that are going to have to be met by employees that are on an FWA in order for it to work, right? And then the procedures for requesting. When is it going to be required? If you're going to be working from home, more than, 1 day a week, more than 2 days a week, if it's going to be, again, on a regular basis, I think anything that would require a deviation from the standard work week and work schedule, would be something that, you could consider. That's when you need to have a request that is made by the employee. Similarly, if the employee is going to want to reside, have their primary residence, more than, 50 miles or a 90-minute commute or some type of distance away from the work site, that would be another situation where, it seems like that would be, appropriate to, have a formal request that is made that then you can evaluate. And then, I think, like, as with anything else in this area, the having those objective standards for how your business is going to evaluate these types of requests is critical. There's business considerations and there's employee considerations, but if this is left to manager discretion, I think that is going to be an area that is ripe for, legal risk and litigation, frankly, in terms of different managers applying different standards to different sets of employees. Thoughts, Bill, on how to, what some of those standards should be, or how, the company can, an employer can ensure uniformity in applying clear and consistent standards to procedures for approving an FWA request?
Well, that almost gets, it's a good question. It's a multifaceted question. It almost gets into the simplistic analysis of how many hairs make a beard. I mean, for example, we had a question that was presented to us before we came on the air. It was actually submitted earlier in the week, and the question addressed how do we reconcile the need for some employees who deliver services to the public, such as police, fire, and sanitation, and if other employees are allowed to work remotely from home, and these employees who physically work delivering these services can't, how do you reconcile their standards, the terms and conditions of their employment, their compensation? The question was put: can we pay a different rate and possibly lower rate if they work from home? Well, a counter question to that, without answering that, is, and I think Emily, you and I discussed this, is that one could argue that if an employee is working from home and is not using square footage in his office, his or her office, is not using utilities at his or her office, perhaps we should pay them more because they're saving us on expenses. But that is also offset by the fact that we probably would be expected to reimburse them or pay a stipend toward their data service, their internet service, their if they're working predominantly on the phone. How do we address the cost that they have from working remotely? So it's still a changing environment. We don't have clear answers to that. We're having to address most of it on a case-by-case basis when our employer clients come into us and ask us these very same questions. Not every, it's hard to tell an employee just as it's hard to tell a client. Not everything is going to be fair. Not everything is going to be equally balanced. Some people have more demanding jobs. They're paid a per diem, sometimes in a risk-based supplement to their compensation because they're going in harm's way, such as first responders. The Department of Labor recognizes different compliance standards for first responders under the Fair Labor Standards Act. So there are exceptions that have to be made given the nature of the duties being performed. Are they capable of being performed just as effectively from home or from a remote location? Doesn't necessarily have to be from home. So we're unfortunately still at a point where we're having to address this on a case-by-case basis.
Right. And I think some of that goes back to your eligibility and your, kind of procedures for approval, right? I mean, what you want to avoid is managers treating similarly situated employees different. Is there a legitimate, objective business reason for the distinction between, two different employees And if there is, most likely that's going to be defensible, right? But what you need to have and what you need to use in your policy are things like, for instance, let's go, the one manager is going to say, well, I approved it for John, but not for Debbie, because, John, is always a high performing employee and Debbie isn't, right? Well, then let's make sure that eligibility requires something in it, in terms of having, better than average performance evaluations or something, right? But we don't want two different managers applying two different sets of standards, in evaluating these requests. And the bigger the organization, the more important it becomes to also have, that secondary level of review and approval through human resources or, from higher ups, to ensure that there is kind of consistent application of the standards when you're, approving one of these requests, right? And that's, I think, the value in thinking through what your eligibility procedures are going to be, and that criteria, when you receive one of these different requests. And can you tie it to a legitimate business reason that is uniformly, kind of applied throughout your organization? So I think managing, and these same concerns kind of come through in managing the flexible work arrangements, right? And I think some of the questions that we're getting in our Q&As kind of touch on some of these. And so we'll talk about those as we address this. I think to your point, Bill, about culture, right? I mean, a lot of, organizations are nervous that if we go and we allow this, that we are going to lose that element of culture. One way to address this is through core work hours, right? So even if you're working remotely, or even if you're on, some type of different FWA arrangement, there's a set hour, each day that employees are expected to be logged in and online and working, so that they can have that collaboration and have that feedback, and you can be able to schedule meetings and know that people are going to be in attendance at them. I think that's one important, part of that. The other thing could be core work days. So Bill, back to your point about the ratio of 3 days, 3 days in the 3 days working remotely, 2 days in the office, or vice versa, however you do it. Maybe those days are going to be, we want everyone in the office Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, right? Absent unusual circumstances or something like that. Bill, you touched on security earlier. Do you want to talk a little bit about security?
Absolutely, Emily. As we all have come to painfully appreciate, cybersecurity and the security and integrity of our networks is of paramount importance. These breaches that we read about, some of us have experienced them, are costly. They result in tremendous expenses, both in terms of, even if it goes so far as ransomware payments. We have several hospital clients in the state of Alabama that have had to deal with ransomware holdups, where their networks were infiltrated, and then they had to pay a premium to regain use of the network. And unfortunately, during the period of time when those networks were down, you had patients that had healthcare delivery issues, that had problems resulting from the inability of physicians to review online charting. And many of these hospitals had employees that were working remotely. When you're doing transcription of medical records, they have outsourced vendors, they have people working at home. It's equally plausible, and I think in at least one instance it was determined that perhaps the breach came through the access to the network that was being handed through a remote employee, if I recall correctly. So we have to ensure that when those individuals are accessing our network from a remote location, that the security protocols that we know that are enforced when they come into the physical office are going to be equally effective from that remote location. That is part of the eligibility consideration that we discussed earlier. If that employee does not have a secure remote location that comply with our network security requirements, then that employee will not be eligible to work remote. So that's a huge concern. We also, we can get into this later also, is that you have to make sure that you have online compliance capabilities where individuals can log in and be documented as being actually at work and participating in work, not just logged in and then running off to the mall and then coming back at lunch and responding to a few emails and then running off to an appointment of some kind. They, as you mentioned earlier, when they need to be physically present, logged in, and in a position where they can collaborate with co-employees, answer questions in a timely manner, respond to customer or other employee inquiries in a timely manner. So, but the network security and cyber security is a vital part of this remote work environment that we're discussing today.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about, you know, who's going to pay for all that equipment on the next slide, I think. But I think, you know, that the IT security kind of goes hand in hand with equipment, devices. You know, people, you know, if they're not able to easily access their, you know, the company provided network, are they going to start doing work on their personal devices? And then what happens if the personal device is stolen or lost or left unattended or locked? You know, so really, you know, when you have this type of employee, you want to think about also implementing the software and technology that you need to manage that. So for instance, being able to remotely wipe a cell phone, a laptop, you know, in the event that a device that contains company information is lost or stolen. Two-factor authentication, you know, I think even we gripe internally, you know, at our firm about having, you know, to have that two-factor authentication, but I think it is really important to begin and probably becoming just standard that you have that type of technology if you're going to be considering it. And if it sounds expensive, you know, I think anyone who's dealt with some type of a cybersecurity breach would tell you that they wish they had done that on the front end, right, as opposed to deal with the losses and consequences on the back end of those things. So you know, I think another you know element here is dress code. We got an email from our HR director this morning about, you know, revising dress code, and you know, these, I'll note that as we're thinking about even though we're addressing these topics in this in under the FWA, I think, you know, every business environment employer probably also needs to have a policy that says these types of things are going to apply anytime someone's working remotely, regardless of whether it's under a formal FWA or it is a, you know, an intermittent or, you know, kind of infrequent instance where they are having to work at home. So, you know, I know one issue that, you know, my clients have struggled with is, you know, people coming to meetings and not being on camera or not being, you know, in a work presentable, you know, appearance. And so those are the things that kind of go to culture that you know, as an employer, if you're going to allow someone the opportunity to have this flexibility, then you also, you know, have the right to require certain things when it comes to you know, dress code and appearance, and you just need to adapt and modify your policies to apply in this, you know, remote environment, I think. You know, and again, I think if you have those expectations, then they're clearly set forth in the policy itself, it becomes a lot easier to enforce them than if you're trying to do it kind of like a whack-a-mole approach with some of these issues, you know, in managing this remote workforce. Bill, do you want to talk a little bit about you know, performance evaluations? You know, how do managers kind of provide feedback to employees and you know, what needs to change from maybe some of the traditional ways that you need to be thinking about in a flexible work arrangement scenario?
Well, I think that performance evaluations are one of the areas where an in-person setting is to be recommended. I mean, these kinds of virtual computer screen presentations such as what we're involved in right now are very good. They have allowed us to communicate much more flexibly, just for the very reasons we're discussing today. But when an employee is being evaluated, which is typically an annual one-time event, unless they're in some kind of remedial or probationary status, that in-person eye-to-eye contact is irreplaceable in my judgment. So I think that you need to be able to have those kind of conversations in person. Regardless, that employee may be a 100% remote employee working across the country somewhere. And in that instance, then you may have to settle for a remote video discussion. But it's also not too much to ask an employee to come into your office once a year. I don't care where they are on the other side of the world. But that's going to be an employer decision with that employee. But you have to have accountability. You have to be able to measure accountability. Accountability is not only to the metrics or the measurements that are the basis for evaluating that employee's productivity or all the employees' productivity, but it's also the accountability for compliance in all the areas that we have to measure compliance. I mean, whether it's training, whether it's typically it's all of the required training, whether it's Title VII, Title IX, whether it's any of the constitutional, what I call constitutional sensitivity, constitutional compliance training for managers and employees, so that employees know how to report misconduct. You can obviously, as we know, you can obviously have actionable misconduct remotely, just as you have in person. I mean, we deal with administrative and judicial in-court complaints of sexually suggestive or harassing communications where the two employees were never in the same room together, either through texting, either through email, either through some combination of them, through inter-office intranet communications such as the Slack portal and Slack inter-office email messaging system. So you have to be sensitive to that in both your training and your compliance measurements. But at the heart of all this is the question the employer has to ask is, what is the most effective way for me to communicate my concerns to my employees when it's time to have these kinds of discussions? And most employers are going to say, I need to have that employee in the office. We need to have managers talking to them, evaluating their concerns, and there's nothing that replaces that in-person setting for those purposes.
Yeah, and just as you were saying that, I kind of had a few more things pop into my head. In terms of managing this, as an employer, I think you have the right and should require that any person who's going to be working in a remote environment has a designated workspace that is private or semi-private, right? I mean, as you're saying this, I had a client that had to do an employee termination the other day and was sitting there on the phone with this employee, and the employee's husband just takes over the phone and starts talking, to the employer about the termination, right? And discloses that the wife has a health condition and deserves a second chance and all of it. I mean, if this employee was sitting in an office, this would have never happened, right? And so insisting that, that there are not just for, business confidentiality, especially depending on the nature of the business, you don't want someone sitting at a Starbucks with company information, taking company calls in a way that could, breach confidentiality. Similarly, even before COVID, it was, a requirement that, if you're going to be allowed to work from home, you have to have childcare. You know, and that goes back to kind of making sure that if employees are going to be allowed to do this work in a different environment, we are holding them accountable for actually working when they are in that environment. So you're not going to be taking calls from a car or from, you know, some non-private environment or not at a designated workspace. And I think that goes back to managing this balance. We received a question about, you know, parameters for managing balance of freedom for the employee, but appropriate amount of accountability. And then, you know, Bill, back to your point about the software that you can, you know, procure that will allow you to track employees and how productive are they being. And, you know, the other thing about these FWAs is they are always subject to be changed, ended, terminated if the employee is not performing in that environment. And these are the tools that, you know, if you implement these aspects in your policy and hold employees accountable, then that gives you the ability to manage it from a performance standpoint, from a counseling standpoint, you know, if you need to, I think. So just a few kind of points that I had on that front. Equipment. Let's talk about equipment. Because I know that a lot of employers have questions about who is going to be paying for employees to work remotely. And some of that may depend on what state you're in. Is that right, Bill?
Absolutely. And there are several jurisdictions that have now adopted standards that explicitly set out what the employer is required to provide for the employee that is going to be working remotely. And if you allow the employee to work remotely and you are going to require certain standards for their computer or their communications equipment, then if they don't have that capability at home, that actually goes into, along with the private workspace and the child care and the other things you spoke of on the previous slide, that goes into that eligibility intake discussion. It's not a walk in the park for these employees when they are requesting the ability to work remotely. They have to be able to comply with the employee's stated and announced and well articulated and published standards for remote work. And if they can't, then that's part of the decision-making process and whether they're going to be allowed to do so. But I think it's not unreasonable for an employee to request a stipend or a partial reimbursement for the cost of their internet service, their data service, particularly if the data service has to be upgraded. As we all know, internet service download, upload speeds vary tremendously, and they're throttled and all the other things that go into that. And if you're going to have an announced standard for the kind of internet quality, service and data quality at the remote location, and it can be achieved only through a increased cost, then the employer can be expected to field a question to subsidize that cost or to handle it through a monthly payroll addition. So those are issues that you're going to have to be prepared to address. In that regard, and one of the questions we have here that is actually sort of novel, and it's one that I haven't thought about, and you and I haven't previously discussed it, which is what about employee safety, which is a broad category. Employee safety for those employees that are working remotely. They're working at their home, they're working in a comfortable situation, or they're working in another remote location, but it's in a setting of their choice that complies with the employer standard. But what safety requirements do we have at the office that we're complying with that we may not be complying with in a remote location? It's hard for me to give you a particular example right now, but because it's a question that has never been presented to us.
Right.
You're assuming that the employee knows the risk of that might be existing at their home. We just send the remote location in from home. But what if they develop, for example, a posture-related problem with their seating arrangement at home? We deal with those every day at the office. We replace chairs. We get recommended orthopedic chairs sometimes for people with issues. Would you be expected to do that at home? My initial thought on that is that you might want to consider that the employee executes an acknowledgement of some sort that will allow that employee to accept the risk of whatever those conditions are at his or her chosen remote location, and insulates the employer from exposure for any issues that might arise from a safety-related condition. Again, these are one of the evolving landscape questions that we're having to address as we receive them, but those will be my thoughts right offhand.
Yeah, and I'll chime in a little bit on the safety issue. You know, one, you know, I do believe OSHA has given us some guidance on this, and I don't know how helpful that guidance is. You know, but you know, generally speaking, you know, you as an employer don't have a duty to go and inspect, you know, someone's home to make sure it is a safe, you know, working environment. However, you know, we do know that, you know, if someone is injured in their home and is working, that we have workers' comp, you know, that's going to apply here. So that, you know, it could be that someone gets up to go to the bathroom and trips and injures themselves, and you have a workers' comp claim, and we can't ignore that as an employer because, you know, the person is, you know, if that had happened in the office, that would be a claim, right? And so now the question, the question is, you know, what if the employee has left home to go pick up a child from school or something and is then in a car accident, right? Am I responsible then? Well, the normal, you know, principles of workers' comp law would apply. And I would say probably not, because they've departed from the course and scope of their employment and going to do, you know, a personal chore. But, you know, from an employer standpoint, you know, we need to be cognizant of, you need to do that first report of injury, even for people who may be injured in a remote home environment, right? And so, you know, and to your point about the kind of special chairs and equipment, and that we're getting kind of into ADA world. So I'll go ahead and move us along to our next slide, which is compliance. And this is all of these issues, you know, kind of come up there. I mean, we certainly need to be considering reasonable accommodation requests for special equipment and things of that nature, ergonomic chairs. You know, even if someone is in a remote setting, we can't, the fact that that person isn't in an office environment anymore doesn't obfuscate those responsibilities that you have as an employer. On that note, Bill, I'm gonna throw this question to you that we've received. You know, can an employer restrict an employee who is on any type of special leave from qualifying for remote work? And the example is, you know, for instance, someone who is taking intermittent FMLA. You got some thoughts on that?
I think that goes back to the eligibility assessment. And my personal thought on that is that if you're in an unpaid leave status, then you're not going to be providing services for the employer. And so therefore you wouldn't be qualified for remote work while you're in the unpaid leave status.
Right, while you're taking unpaid leave, right? We don't, if someone is on, let's first talk about continuous FMLA, because that's an easier one, right? If someone's on continuous FMLA, they should not be working at all, not even remotely, right? Yeah. And then the other question though is, if someone is on intermittent FMLA leave, you know, I think you have to be careful about discriminating against an employee, you know, kind of going back to would they qualify for something? Again, it needs to be driven by the job. Is it appropriate? Is it not appropriate? Not is the person on FMLA leave or needs intermittent FMLA leave or not? Because that could be, again, it may depend on the circumstances and the reason for the denial. And if it's job related and not related to the need for leave, it may be permissible, but I think you have to be careful in those areas.
I think that the intermittent FLA status alone would not be you wouldn't have enough information to make a decision. I think that an individual that's on intermittent FMLA during those non-leave periods could very well qualify for remote work status based on that individual employer's eligibility assessment.
Right. So we going back to kind of other broader compliance topics that, employers need to be thinking about. We talked about workers' comp. What that also means is you need to make sure that if you have an employee that you are allowing to work in Michigan, you may need to have workers' compensation insurance that covers that employee performing remote work in Michigan. Right. And so making sure that you check with your workers' comp carrier, and because many of those policies will exclude someone from coverage if they're not in a state that you have a policy that covers. And so you need to be thinking about that and make sure you're talking with your broker about that. Bill, do you want to kind of touch on wage and hour issues? There's a lot to unpack just with that alone.
There really is. I mean, wage and hour compliance, FLSA compliance is difficult enough when the employees are coming into the workplace and maintaining regular hours that are documented and observable. But when they are working from a remote location, that compliance chore is magnified many times in its difficulty. It's really going to almost be impossible unless you have a very good, and right now we're talking exempt employees, non-exempt employees that we have to track their time that's otherwise subject to the FLSA. You need to have your software program that allows an employee to log in and to document their breaks and to log out. You need to be able to compile a time clock record that will track those records, that complies with your obligation as an employer to maintain accurate records of the employees working. Work hours. If you have that in place, then it's just a matter of making sure that that employee complies with his or her expected policies as if they were coming in on the floor in the physical workplace. But it's going to require more oversight from the supervisor and from the employer than it typically would if they were physically on site. So you just have to that.
I think a few points on that. If you don't have some type of clock in, clock out software for these remote employees, and you're requiring them to self-report hours every day, and it's 9 to 5 with a 30-minute lunch break, and then that's what you're getting, that's a problem. I think most people, that's not accurate, and you have an obligation as an employer to keep accurate records. And so, I also think you should be requiring the employee to review those records and certify that they are accurate at the end of each work week. But if you, as the as the manager or payroll supervisor, are looking at that, and that's when you need to kind of have a discussion with the employee about how the time is being tracked. And it's better to just avoid it entirely by moving to one of these software solutions that allows you to better and more accurately track time. I think, the other thing that goes hand in hand with this is off the clock work. When someone's in a remote environment, it is very easy to, they're not working, but someone needs something, and so can you go in and can you do this real quick, and they may log in and send something, and that needs to be compensated, unless it's de minimis, and you don't want to be in a position where you're making that argument. So making sure that you have an off the clock policy and that you are, enforcing it too. Requiring people to, having an easy way for people to report those hours and to track them. We talked a lot about privacy and confidentiality, so I don't know that we need to retouch on that topic, but it's an important one that, you need to be thinking of here. Disability accommodation, thoughts on that, Bill? I think one thing that jumps to my mind is it's going to be harder if you are generally open to allowing flexible work arrangements to deny one when it is requested as a part of a request for a reasonable accommodation, unless, again, you have a legitimate job reason for the difference in treatment for the employee that is making that request.
I couldn't agree with you more, Emily. I mean, this goes back to what we said at the outset, where you're going to have clearly articulated standards for allowing remote work and or disallowing remote work. And basically, you've got to ask yourself as an employer, and I suggest that senior principals with the employer discuss this with their managers and their HR personnel. Do we require our employees to be here? For those employees that we are going to require to physically come on the site, why are we doing so? We can't just have some abstract reasoning because we like to be able to lay eyes on them. We like to be able to interact with them. We like to perpetuate that office culture. We think it's part of who we are and what we do. But courts and the administrative oversight agencies, such as the Department of Labor, EEOC, are going to look at it much more explicitly and much more rigorously. What are the requirements? Are the requirements simply that you're going to be able to process applications for 25 widgets a day? That's your minimum quota. And you can do that equally as well off-site as on-site. And you have an individual that has a disability that made it particularly difficult for them to commute to work, and they requested an accommodation that would allow them to take advantage of the company's new remote work policies. You're going to be hard pressed to deny that type of request unless you have a clearly articulated policy. So mixing the ADA in with your remote work policies can be a minefield. We really have to be very careful about it and question what your motivations are.
Right. And there's probably a whole webinar we could do on that subject alone, and the wage and hour implications. But I want to touch on out-of-state considerations because I hear this a lot. What if we could require them to work in Florida, but they really want to move to Georgia, and isn't that can't we just call them something other than a remote worker and somehow avoid the clear implications that result from them being in a different state? I am telling people that my, rule of thumb on this is that if they are primarily working in another state, you need to treat them as an employee of that state. That means payroll tax purposes. That means state leave purposes. That means any of those local or, state laws that would apply to that person. Minimum wage, if the state where there's a higher minimum wage, those things need to be, they need to be treated as an employee of that state. And that may mean that you need to use some type of an administrative employer if you're not set up to do business and to pay someone in another state. Do you have thoughts on that, Bill?
I think that you've got to, this whole notion of remote work considerations expands the employer's footprint. You may not really have thought that you were dealing with out-of-state considerations, or that you would be confronted with the need to address multi-jurisdictional legal issues if you only sold widgets in Alabama and you only have workers selling widgets in Alabama and you only have Alabamians buying widgets. But the minute that you have an employee relocate and otherwise qualifies for your remote work eligibility, you're doing business in Michigan. You need to be aware of what those additional requirements are going to be. You need to be asking your local council, and also local council in Alabama, as well as local council in the foreign jurisdiction that you're now doing business in. What are those additional requirements? Do I have to qualify? Do I have to file any additional disclosure? Am I going to be subject to not only the Alabama and EEOC oversight, but am I going to be subject to that second state's human rights commissions? Many states have state level equal employment agencies. So all of a sudden you are confronted with a whole new world of compliance decisions that you never really considered when you allowed that very valuable employee the opportunity to work remotely from their new home in another state. So the whole myriad of doing business in another state, those issues now confronts you. Everything from tax and revenue issues and accounting issues to the full range of employee management and oversight. So for that one employee that you allow to work in Michigan or wherever.
Or California, right? I mean,
yeah, we don't, California's a whole nother webinar.
Right. Well, I think we're past our hour, and if anyone has additional questions, please feel free to let us know what those are, and we will reach out to you to try to address those. I appreciate everyone for joining us this morning on what we know is kind of a complex and nuanced topic, but hopefully, we've given you some things to contemplate as you are thinking through your flexible work arrangement policy and what will work for your business. So happy Friday, everyone, and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.